Hello and welcome back to Finding the Alternative. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us as we deconstruct through God's Word. Today's subject is going to be about sunset reckoning and the feast. But before we understand the feast, we really have to understand the timekeeping of the ancient Jews to make sense of the feast. Only after that can the feast be easily explained. Now, to be clear as a Christian, whether the day begins at sunset or sunrise, it does not matter for salvation. But to the Jews or the Christians trying to observe the Torah, then it is a matter of salvation. To our good friends in the WMSCOG, this is a matter of heaven or hell. This video may require you to watch it a couple times to really understand what I am trying to say. I do my best to convey the information as simple and precisely as I can, so if you don't understand the subject, it's not your fault, it's mine, so don't feel bad, okay? On that note, I guarantee that if you stick with me and you are able to understand the information I am presenting in this video, there will be a massive payoff in the next video about the Sabbath day. As always, before we get into the subject today, if you have not watched my intro video to the channel, please go watch that first. I put it on the screen for your convenience. Then come back and join us for today's subject. Now that that's out of the way, let's go. Number 1, what is the teaching of the WMSCOG in regards to sunset reckoning and sunrise reckoning? Number 2, what is the origin of sunset reckoning? We can see it in creation, actually. Number 3, what does the Bible and history say about sunset reckoning? And number 4, our conclusion, sunset reckoning is biblically accurate and reasonable, meaning sunrise is not the beginning of day in certain contexts. Now, the WMSCOG is fixated on making literally everything a salvation issue. Literally everything. Since they are adamant that the 7 feasts and 3 times are essential for salvation even today. In other words, this subject is crucial. Another reason they believe the day begins at sunrise is because their founder Ahnsahnghong restored it and taught it. It also separates them from everyone else, such as the Worldwide Church of God established by Herbert Armstrong and the Seventh-day Adventist Church that keep the Sabbath from Friday evening to Saturday evening, and even the Jews who do it in this way as well. In this way, the WMSCOG can say that everyone else is wrong and that they are right. This implies that the Jews, who have had the same method of understanding when the beginning of the Jewish day is, have been wrong for thousands of years. Ultimately making this a very personal attack on the Jews, since they don't know when their own day begins. It is important to note that the Phoenicians, Numidians, Babylonians, and other nations also observed their days from sunset to sunset. So this practice was very common in the ancient world. In today's subjects, we're going to look at a few verses and see what fits better, sunset reckoning or sunrise reckoning, and which one is biblical. Though it is important to note that the Jewish day, just like our day, does not refer to the light portion, but also the dark portion as well. For instance, Luke chapter 2 verse 11 indicates this day is referring to the night when Jesus was born. Also, as we dive into this, keep in mind that we are looking at this at 24-hour increments that include both night, day, evening, and morning. It is important to note that when we are talking about when the day begins, we are talking about when the 24-hour period starts and resets. Not to be confused with what the Jews considered their daytime, meaning the hours of sun. Of course, the Jews began their work and tasks in the daytime and considered that their day when the sun was up. They also divided up their day into 24 hours as well to keep track of time just like us. Their 24 hours contain morning, afternoon, evening, and nighttime. What we are trying to figure out is when that time starts. What we are talking about specifically is when did the Jewish weekdays or feast days begin? Let's see Genesis first. To be completely honest, this verse is very hard to understand regardless of whether you believe in sunset reckoning or sunrise reckoning. But let's give it a go and see what we can analyze. Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 5. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Now let me ask you a question. What existed first, light or dark? According to verse 2, darkness existed first. Not only that, but if you read Isaiah chapter 45 verse 7, it is written that God created darkness. Then after God created darkness, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Then God got to work separating the light from the darkness, giving the light the name day, and the darkness he called it night. Then evening came, and then morning, the first day. Now we need to examine what the first day is here. Well, let's see, when did this day begin? In the beginning, what was there? Darkness. Then God created light. Then God named and separated them. So is verse 5 recalling the events of that first day? Could be, it seems to match, and it makes sense. Let's see then if sunrise reckoning fits first. If the light is the beginning of the day, what is the point of verse 2 showing that darkness existed first? Let's also consider sunrise reckoning and apply it to verses 1 to 5. If the light God created in verse 3 is the beginning of the day, and then in verse 5 we see the morning dawns, would it not be the second day in that case if the day indeed begins in the morning or daytime? If the light is daytime and there is evening, then the next morning should be the second day, not the first. So that is important to note here. If you insist that the day does begin in the morning, then the next morning is a different day. You could insist that the words the first day in verse 5 are simply a recap of what had just happened earlier in creation, but there is also a problem there as well. You would also have to say that darkness was first, not the light or day. Unless you want to just forget and ignore verse 2, but I don't think that that is a wise habit to start. So what can we make sense of this mess? Well, we see that God gives us all the aspect of the full day. You have night, day, evening, and morning. You also see that verse 5 gives a clear recap of what just transpired in the creation. The phrase, "and there was evening and there was morning," does not change order regardless of the day. Darkness always precedes light, and evening always precedes morning. It is also important to note what is being done. God is creating something out of nothing, order out of disorder. We can see that time and time again. God created heaven and earth out of nothing. Also the earth was empty, void, formless, and dark. Then God created light and separated the light from the darkness, creating order out of disorder. The evening and morning motif applies here. God created the vault to separate the waters, named the vault sky. Again, God created something out of nothing. He created order out of disorder. The evening and morning motif applies here as well, showing how God is working. God created the ground and separated the ground from the sky and the waters. Then God produced vegetation on the ground. Again, we see God created something out of nothing. He created order out of disorder. Again, we see the evening and morning motif reiterating how God is working. And on it goes. Each subsequent day is a reenactment of the events from the first day. From nothing, something was created. From disorder, order was created. Hence, there was evening and there was morning. Personally, I feel that sunset reckoning fits best in the creation timeline, but it's not entirely clear, and that is just the reality. Since the Hebrew language has changed over time, it is very difficult to fully understand what Moses was trying to say here. Just like how we as Americans don't speak the same as we did 200 years ago, and that some of the phrases or words we don't use today and have lost their meaning. But let's not stop here. If you are already confused, it's okay. Hang tight, we'll try to clear this up. At the end, we will make a bigger picture. Now, we're going to take a look at Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus chapter 23 to discuss when the Passover and unleavened bread begins. Firstly, we need to understand the different twilights in the Hebrew day, otherwise this will be extremely confusing. On a Hebrew day, there are two evenings. There's an evening during the day and an evening of the night. Let me explain. The Hebrew day begins at sunrise around 6 a.m. or hour 0. The evening of the day is at the 6th hour or high noon. Why? Because the 6th hour is the time or high noon when the sun is at the highest point in the sky, and after the 6th hour, or noon, the sun begins to decline. Then when the sun starts to set, usually around the 12th hour, it is finally evening. So to put it simply, the first evening is the 6th hour, and the second evening is the 12th hour. But not only that, but there is also something called between the two evenings, which is the 9th hour. Now, I know what you're thinking, why not just say 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and 6 p.m., etc.? Well, I hesitate to do that because the ancient Jews calculated time based on the position of the sun. It is totally different from our timekeeping. Today, we have 60-minute blocks of time regardless of the year and phases of the sun. This is not how it worked back then. Since the Jews kept track of their hours by the sun, it means their hours were longer or shorter depending on the time of year. For instance, sometimes their hours were only 45 minutes in the winter, and in the summertime, their hours could be almost 75 minutes long, meaning their evening or sunset could be as early as 5 or 6 in the winter and as late as 9 or 10 in the summertime. Also, sometimes in the Hebrew language, there is between the evenings or 9th hour, which is used in Exodus chapter 12 verse 6 and Leviticus chapter 23 verse 5, as we will see here in just a minute. Now, I'm not saying that the Passover was being eaten at 3 p.m., just that the lambs were slaughtered at 3 p.m. How do we know this? Well, in the regulation of the Passover lamb in Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus chapter 23, God said you were to first slaughter the lamb, which takes time. Then cook the lamb to eat it, prepare the bitter herbs, and make unleavened bread. So meaning they slaughtered the Passover lamb at 3 p.m. so they could prepare it to be able to eat it later that night. Essentially, you're making a feast for your family, and if you've ever done that before, it takes hours. Now, imagine you also have to butcher the animal and prepare it. so depending on how big your family is, determines how long it will take. The main point here is that the WMSCOG teaches that the twilight when the lambs were slaughtered in Exodus chapter 12 verse 6 and Leviticus chapter 23 verse 5 means sunset. That is why they eat their bread and wine around 8 p.m. or sunset. If you look at the Hebrew word, the twilight here is areb, or between the evenings, aka 9th hour. With all that information, let's move on to Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 20 verses 14 to 20. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. This is all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you are to eat the bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live you must eat unleavened bread. Now let's compare this to Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 23 verses 5 and 6. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord. And on the 7th day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. Here, as we just read, according to God's command, when does the feast of unleavened bread begin? According to Exodus chapter 12, verse 18, the feast of unleavened bread begins on the 14th day in the evening, and ends on the evening of the 21st day. But in Leviticus, it says that unleavened bread begins on the 15th day. Then, which is it? 14th day in the evening, or 15th day in the morning? I am well aware that the Bible groups the Passover and unleavened bread together. If you're not sure, please read Ezekiel chapter 45 verse 21. Passover and unleavened bread are interchangeable. But again, that still does not clear up the discrepancy of when does unleavened bread begin. If we use sunrise reckoning, it is a blatant contradiction. It would mean that unleavened bread begins on 2 different days, which makes no sense. Sunset reckoning, however, gives us a very clear answer. If the day begins at evening, then what does that tell us? It tells us that the Passover and unleavened bread are starting at the exact same time. The Passover sacrifice is eaten in the night following the daylight hours of the first month 14th day. Meaning when the sun went down on that first month 14th day, what happened? The first month 15th day began. Which means that the Passover sacrifice was being eaten at the exact same time the unleavened bread or first month 15th day was commencing. To put it simply, when the evening comes on the first month 14th day, it bleeds into the start or beginning of the first month 15th day according to sunset reckoning. Now that we understand this, let me paint the picture of the Passover and unleavened bread in Exodus and Leviticus side by side without any contradictions. According to Exodus chapter 12 verse 6 and Leviticus chapter 23 verse 5, the Lord's Passover begins on the first month 14th day at twilight, which again in Hebrew is areb, or between the evenings, or 3 p.m. or 9th hour. However, that is not when they ate it. This is when it begins. Then, when does it begin? When the lamb is slaughtered at 3 p.m. or the 9th hour between the evenings. But then you have to prepare it, cook it to eat, bake the unleavened bread, get the bitter herbs, among other things. Also, depending on how many people or families will be celebrating it, would determine how many lambs or goats are needed. But there is no specific hour or time to eat it. They could take as long as they needed, as long as they ate it before the morning, because after that they would have to burn it. Also, God said that the particular Passover in Exodus chapter 12 should be eaten in haste because that same night they also left Egypt, but we don't find that regulation repeated in Leviticus. Then Exodus chapter 12 verse 8 and Leviticus chapter 23 verse 6, we see that night they are to eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Then why? Because that night is the first month 15th day or unleavened bread. The verses that we just saw show us that the eating of the Passover is the beginning of first month 15th day or unleavened bread. Therefore, eating the Passover lamb and the start of the first month 15th day were happening at the exact same time. Combining Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus chapter 23, when understood through sunset reckoning, it is not contradictory at all. It is in complete unison. I really hope this makes sense, but if not, leave a comment or reach out to me and I will explain better. I am doing my best here. Now, let's examine the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 26 to 32. The Lord said to Moses, "The 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. Do not do any work on that day because it is the Day of Atonement. When atonement is made for you before the Lord your God, those who do not deny themselves on that day must be cut off from their people. I will destroy from among their people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. It is a day of Sabbath rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. From the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening, you are to observe your Sabbath." Here is a very interesting passage. We have the 10th day of the 7th month as the Day of Atonement. But then it says the evening of the 9th day to the following evening. How does this make sense? The best way to understand it is to simply show it. First, we will show how the WMSCOG teaches this verse. At first glance, it makes sense and shows that sunset reckoning is nonsense. But their explanation also contradicts what the Bible is saying and doesn't provide any explanation of how verse 32 can be applied. We can't just be satisfied with verse 27 and forget that verse 32 exists. Then how do we make sense of this passage without adding or taking away? Here, the WMSCOG shows that they misunderstand what sunset reckoning is. They simply misunderstand that the evening of whatever day it is the beginning of the following day. Also, we have a similar issue that we discussed on unleavened bread. With day reckoning, the Bible gives us 2 start dates as opposed to just 1. If you take the time to look at this graph, it actually looks like neither way the WMSCOG teaches this makes any sense. Day reckoning provides us 2 start dates, and the way the WMSCOG presents sunset reckoning makes it seem like you completely missed the Day of Atonement. So neither their insistence for day reckoning or their countermeasure to the sunset reckoning that the WMSCOG presents makes any sense here and doesn't fit. If anything, it just creates more problems and questions rather than a solution. Then how do we rectify this verse and harmonize the scriptures? I will show you what I think these verses are saying. You don't have to believe me. I challenge you to do your own research and come to your own conclusion. Given what we have seen so far with creation and the Passover and unleavened bread, it is really simple. We have to understand the biblical pattern and find harmony in the scriptures. Not to try to make scriptures fit our doctrine. We also have to remember how the real understanding of sunset reckoning works. What starts the evening of the 9th day? The 10th day. Then it means the following evening would start the 11th day, but also conclude the 10th day. If we use sunset reckoning here, there is no contradiction. Now, let's move on. We're going to look at the water of cleansing and the regulation of touching a dead body. Numbers chapter 19, verses 11 and 19. Whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. The man who is clean is to sprinkle those who are unclean on the 3rd and 7th days, and on the 7th day he is to purify them. Those who are being cleansed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and that evening they will be clean. According to this regulation, a person who touches a dead body will be unclean for 7 days. Now let's suppose we are following sunrise reckoning, and let's say you touch a dead body Monday morning. Then that would imply 7 mornings or days from that point you will be clean, correct? But it says you are unclean till the evening of the 7th day, right? So that would technically be 7.5 days. It contradicts the passage. Regardless of what day of the week you touch a dead body, you still have the same issue. In fact, it will never be 7 days, but it will always be over 7 days. Then let's consider sunset reckoning. If you touch a dead body on Monday morning, you will be considered unclean from that evening, since it is the start of the next day, since we can't go backwards. Then that would imply 7 evenings from that point you will be clean, right? Yes, because that evening on the 7th day, you will be clean a week later. This means that the water of cleansing regulation actually proves sunset reckoning. Also, it is important to note that the person who touches a dead body in this passage is unclean till evening. Why? Because evening starts the new day in sunset reckoning. Otherwise, the Bible would say they will be clean till the next morning or following morning, but it doesn't say that. But what about in the New Testament? Let's see a few verses. First, we'll see Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 to 61. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. Here we see evening was approaching and they were putting Jesus in the tomb. Let's see another verse. Luke chapter 23, verses 50 to 56. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had been laid yet. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The woman who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in accordance to the commandment. Here it says that the Sabbath was about to begin, so they laid him in the tomb and left to keep the Sabbath. What can we derive from this verse? Instead of evening approaching, it says the Sabbath was about to begin. Evening approaching are the same words as the Sabbath was about to begin, meaning the Sabbath begins at evening or sunset. But again, let's look at it from the sunrise reckoning perspective also. Evening was approaching, which would mean they probably wanted to get everything done before nightfall, because it would be very hard to do what they needed to do with the body in the dark or with a candle. But I have a question. If this is preparation day just before sunset or evening, then why would Luke mention that the Sabbath is about to begin? Because they still have quite a few hours to go from evening to sunrise, which the sunrise in this case would be the Sabbath. The wording just doesn't really fit. Let's see another perspective in sunrise reckoning. If the Sabbath is about to begin at dawn, it means that they are working in the early hours of the morning just before sunrise. Hence the words, the Sabbath was about to begin, therefore justifying the phrase that Luke wrote. But that puts Matthew at odds with the other accounts because he said evening was approaching and not that it was evening or dark yet. And if that is the case, what took place between what Matthew said was happening before evening and what Luke said what was happening before the Sabbath or the coming morning in this case? It would appear we have an extended period of time where either it is lost or nothing happened. Also, it gives us two starting points of the Sabbath. One gospel says that the Sabbath or evening was approaching. And if you adhere to the day reckoning, Sabbath starts Saturday morning at dawn. So here it appears Sabbath day has two starting points. It doesn't make sense. Day reckoning is contradictory and does not harmonize the Gospels. Sunset reckoning, on the other hand, fits perfectly. It gives us only one starting point for the Sabbath and gets rid of the space of time that is unaccounted for preparation night. Let's understand the timeline now through sunset reckoning. Jesus was before Pilate at 6 a.m., then crucified at Golgotha at 9 a.m. Darkness appeared at noon, Jesus breathed his last at 3 p.m., After Jesus' death, they hurried to take down his body because they didn't want to leave criminals on the cross for the Sabbath. They put his body in the tomb before evening, or as Sabbath was about to begin, at which point the Roman soldiers guarded it and the Jews rested in accordance with the commandment. As we can see, the sunset reckoning clearly harmonizes the scriptures and there is no contradictions. By the way, it was customary for Jews to remove bodies before the evening. If you want, you can check out Joshua chapter 8 verses 29, Joshua chapter 10 verses 26 to 27, Deuteronomy chapter 16 verses 6, chapter 21 verses 21 to 23. But let's confirm sunset reckoning through the resurrection account as well. John chapter 20 verse 1. It reads, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance." Luke chapter 24 verse 1. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Mark 16 verses 1 to 2. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. Matthew chapter 28 verse 1. After the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Here, all the verses seem in order except one. Did you spot which verse is problematic to day reckoning? Do you notice how whenever the WMSCOG teaches the Sabbath or day reckoning, they try to avoid John chapter 20 verse 1? Is there a way we can harmonize all these verses? Or do we just need to look at the ones that fit our narrative and forget that the others exist? Of course we shouldn't do that. Let's consider first sunrise reckoning and examine. All the verses from Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to match and be in accordance with that teaching. That is until you get to John. John says it was still dark, and John also says it is the first day of the week, which is a problem. Because if sunrise reckoning is correct, then this verse is impossible. It can't be dark and can't be the first day of the week, because the other verses indicate that that morning would actually be the first day of the week. Then if the day begins at dawn, That would mean that the dark period before that dawn, or the dawn of the first day of the week, would technically still be the 7th day of the week, according to day reckoning or sunrise reckoning. Otherwise, if that night is indeed the first day of the week, as John says, then it means at dawn that morning would be the 2nd day. If that is the case, then there is a big time discrepancy, so neither of these options work or make sense. In short, sunrise reckoning does not work here. Then let us consider sunset reckoning. Does John work with this theory? Well, considering the first day of the week started at sunset the previous day, it can be dark and can be the first day of the week as well. So this fits perfectly. Then what about the other Gospels? Do they fit sunset theory? Yes. Because when the day dawns and the sun comes up, it is still considered part of the previous night. It is not considered a different day till the following evening. So in this case, it also can be the first day of the week for Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. Sunset reckoning harmonizes both Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Sunrise reckoning only satisfies the Synoptic Gospels and contradicts what John says, which would mean for you to insist on sunrise reckoning, you would have to discount John or disregard what he says. But then if you do that, you would not have the teaching of Jesus being the Word in creation, Jesus' flesh and blood or eternal life, feet washing ceremony, Jesus keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, and other important things. So I wouldn't recommend that route, obviously. Let's see one more verse. John chapter 20, verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Here again, we kind of see something contradictory. You're thinking to yourself, wait, how is it evening, but still the first day of the week? Don't worry, I thought that as well until I did some research. Here, the Greek word for evening is opsios, which means late or evening. However, if you look at Thayer's Greek lexicon, it is used in the sense of between the two evenings, or 3 p.m., or 9th hour. Not gonna lie, with the Greek word evening, it is a lot harder to understand the context because they only have one word for evening. But honestly, this makes sense because considering John was a Jew and knew about the two different evenings and the usage of between the evenings, he would not contradict himself. Also, I think that the discrepancy has a lot to do with translation and misunderstanding of the original text. Let me give you an example. John chapter 19, verse 13. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here's a big problem that I think comes out of a simple mistranslation, which is why I recommend looking into the Greek and the Hebrew to understand the context. Anyways, it appears that John is claiming that it is noon when Jesus is before Pilate. This is a blatant contradiction compared to the other synoptic gospels. The other gospels say Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m. or the 3rd hour. So why is John saying that Jesus is before Pilate at noon? Are we talking about a different Jesus here or what? Well, it is a simple manner of understanding John's perspective. John seems to tell the days of the week by the Jewish sunset reckoning as we clearly saw earlier. But John seems to tell what hour of the day it is by the Roman way of timekeeping. Romans have the same method of timekeeping as we use today. Hour 0 is midnight or 12 a.m. John most likely was referring to the 6th hour by the Roman time, meaning 6 a.m., which corresponds to the other Gospels perfectly. But when the translator came across this passage, I think they might have assumed that John was referring to the 6th hour of the Jews, which would be noon. It is not that shocking of a mistake considering the other Gospels used that method of timekeeping, and John was a Jew. Now, in short summary, John was referring to the 6th hour of the Roman day, which is 6 a.m., not the Jewish 6th hour of the day, which is noon or 12 p.m. That is why understanding the scriptures as a whole is so important, and also trying to understand the original languages, customs, and harmonize everything. Don't just pick and choose, then ignore texts when you think it threatens your narrative. That is not what the Bible is for. Now, what about the feasts? Surely the WMSCOG is right about the feasts and the fulfillment, right? Well, let's analyze that now. Full disclosure, we're only going to cover Unleavened Bread and Ascension Day, and we will discuss trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles, and also analyze the reality of the feasts in coming videos about the restoration. First, I want to talk about Ascension Day. For 9 years, I was taught that Ascension Day was not part of the 7 feasts. In fact, my overseer of 9 years would usually skip over it when teaching the feast. But I have a very big problem with that. If Ascension Day is not part of the feast, then why do you read Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16? Do you remember what it says? 3 times a year, all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. So there is an offering and an attendance just like a normal feast, but yet it's not a feast. Please make that make sense. Not only that, but I have found no evidence that the early church ever celebrated the Ascension Day. Then how does the WMSCOG justify it? You might be thinking, well, it's part of the works of Moses. Let's see what they say in the WMSCOG. Exodus chapter 24, verse 4. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. This is literally the evidence for justification of celebrating the Ascension Day in the WMSCOG. They say Moses went up to God 40 days after landing from the Red Sea. Where is the codification of this? Where is the regulation of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. worship here? Where is the regulation for offering here? Now, to be clear, I'm not against celebrating Ascension Day. What I am against is the WMSCOG saying if you don't keep it, you will not ascend and command offering when there is no proof of the regulation of Ascension Day or the curses or blessings of keeping it anywhere in the Bible or in the early texts outside of the Bible. Now, I brought up my findings about Ascension Day and asked my overseer to help me understand it better. His response was, Ascension Day is not a feast in the Old Testament, but it is a feast in the New Testament. I was pretty shocked when I heard this because this is the first time I have ever heard this and had no notes in the last 9 years supporting this. I then asked my overseer, is there 8 feasts in 3 times now? He said, no, it's just part of the Feast of Weeks, kind of like how trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles are all part of the same feast and are considered one. But one problem, we still count trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles as 3 separate feasts and not one. He was silent. You can't say one feast is combined with another feast, totaling 1, but then say 3 feasts are 1 feast but are still 3 separate feasts. But that is pretty par for the course when it comes to WMSCOG logic, unfortunately. It is contradictory and confusing. I have found no evidence in Scripture supporting Ascension Day as a feast commanded by God, let alone it being connected to the Feast of Weeks in any way, shape, or form. It is a made-up regulation and enforcement that WMSCOG teaches, and it is not biblical. If you want to keep it, go for it, but it will not bring you any closer to God or further from God and is not required. This reminds me of a Christopher Hitchens quote. What can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. I agree 100%. Most of the WMSCOG claims and doctrine are asserted without evidence, which then can also be dismissed without evidence. If you claim to be something special or want people to follow you, the burden of proof is on you. It is your job to prove your claims with evidence. It is not other people's responsibility to prove to you that you are not what you say you are. You have no proof to show why you are the truth and enforce these regulations. I don't need proof to say that you are not the truth and that you don't need to force these regulations, but I will provide it anyway. The only one bringing evidence to the table in this case is me. Lastly, let's look at unleavened bread. This is the most important subject in this video. If you remember one thing from this video, please remember what we discussed about unleavened bread. It is extremely important. Now, we already know that the Passover was eaten in the dark of night on the first month 14th day or beginning of the first month 15th day. That is a biblical fact. Not only that, but there are only 3 feasts and not 7 feasts, according to Exodus chapter 23 and Exodus chapter 34. The 3 feasts have special days within them, but as far as annual feasts are concerned, there are 3, not 7. The 7 feasts in 3 times is not a biblical term. It is 3 feasts with special days contained within them. There is no phrase in the scriptures that says 3 times. It doesn't exist. It simply says 3 feasts. If you are not sure, please ask a Jew nearest you. But that is not the most important part that I want to talk about today. What else should we know about unleavened bread? Well, there is something incredibly shocking that we missed when the WMSCOG taught us this feast. It is that the Feast of First Fruits is actually part of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it is not part of the Feast of Weeks. Not only that, but the Bible says that First Fruits happens during unleavened bread. Leviticus chapter 23 verses 7 to 14. On the first day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord, and on the 7th day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. The Lord said to Moses, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, When you enter the land I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice a burnt offering to the Lord, a lamb a year old without blemish or defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil, and a food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of hin of wine. You must not eat any bread, or roasted or new grain, until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. Here, we see something incredibly important here, is that if you read Numbers chapter 28, verses 16 and 25, about the Passover sacrifice, it is basically identical to the animal sacrifice done on the Feast of First Fruits. Also, it is important to note that in the regulation regarding first fruits, it is not considered a Sabbath or a high day, meaning the Israelites were not required to rest or to avoid work on that day. Just something to keep in mind. Now, we just read in the Bible that the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasts for 7 days. The WMSCOG insists that the first fruits takes place after the Sabbath following unleavened bread, meaning you have the 7 days of unleavened bread. When the unleavened bread concludes, then the Feast of First Fruits begins the day after the following Sabbath, or that Sunday after unleavened bread. This is where the WMSCOG is extremely crafty. They say the priest is to wave it the day after the Sabbath following unleavened bread, when the text actually says the priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. They add the words following unleavened bread. Then why is this important? By adding the words following unleavened bread, they are separating first fruits from unleavened bread, when in actuality, first fruits takes place during unleavened bread. Let me explain. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 11, it talks about the day after the Sabbath, and also this same day after the Sabbath is used to calculate the Feast of Weeks, correct? Now, we need to know, what is this Sabbath referring to? Well, there are 2 possibilities, and we will examine each one. First possibility is that the Sabbath being referred to here is the first day of unleavened bread, or the first month 15th day. Why? In Leviticus 23, verses 4 to 8, you can see that the first month 15th day is considered a Sabbath, as God prohibits work, and it is a sacred assembly. This would put the day after the Sabbath, or in this scenario, the day after the first month 15th day, as the first month 16th day, which would be whatever day of the week it falls on. Now, this fits because if you consider Jesus' crucifixion and burial being on Friday, aka first month 14th day, body was in the tomb first month 15th day, aka Saturday, or unleavened bread, making the day after unleavened bread, aka day after the Sabbath, the first month 16th day, or resurrection day, also known as first fruits. There is a strong case for this one, and it appears to match scripture. The second possibility is that the Sabbath referred to here is talking about the 7th-day weekly Sabbath, and it is not referring to the annual feast Sabbath. Personally, I adhere to this one. Let's say Leviticus chapter 23 verse 11 is indeed talking about the day after the weekly Sabbath. It still fits. I personally believe, and evidence suggests, that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, which is why I adhere to the Sabbath being referenced in Leviticus chapter 23 is talking about the weekly Sabbath, not the annual Sabbath. But we'll get into why I think the crucifixion happened on Wednesday in a later video. But for this example, let's say Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, which would mean Wednesday would be the first month 14th day, Thursday would be the first month 15th day, or unleavened bread. Then the day after the 7th-day weekly Sabbath would be Sunday. So I think this works fine here too. But again, do your own research and come to your own conclusion. It is important to remember that during the Feast of Unleavened Bread that lasts 7 days, there are usually 3 Sabbaths. The first Sabbath is the first month 15th day, then there's the weekly Sabbath that follows. Last but not least, there's the Sabbath that occurs 7 days later on the first month 21st day that is commanded by God. The only exception to this rule is if unleavened bread falls on the 7th-day weekly Sabbath itself. In this case, both the first month 15th day annual Sabbath would be on a weekly Sabbath, and the first month 21st day annual Sabbath would also fall on a weekly Sabbath 7 days later. It is also important to note that the WMSCOG does not observe the first month 21st day that is commanded by God as a sacred assembly in Leviticus chapter 23. This is a very big problem, because if you claim to keep the feast, and on top of that they restored the feast, then why does the WMSCOG not celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days? God commands the first month 15th day as a sacred assembly, and this day holds just as much weight as the first month 21st day, which is the last day of unleavened bread. Or should we just ignore God's words? Now, they say, well, in the New Covenant, the unleavened bread changed from 7 days to 1. Where does it say that in the Bible? Where is the evidence for that? I have found nothing that hints to this alleged change in Scripture or even in the early church records. This insistence sounds just like how Babylon says, well, after the resurrection, the Sabbath day turned into Sunday. Upon hearing this, the WMSCOG calls out the Sunday-keeping churches who make this insistence and even condemn them because Babylon has no evidence to support this alleged change in the scriptures. But when it comes to unleavened bread changing from 7 days to 1 day, the WMSCOG does the exact same thing as Babylon does with Sunday worship. How is it not okay for Babylon to change the daily week of worship to Sunday without evidence? But it is okay for the WMSCOG to change unleavened bread from 7 days to 1 without any biblical evidence. Not only that, but how is that a restoration? This is something completely new. The only evidence for their regulation for unleavened bread and how they observe it is literally Mark chapter 2 verse 20, which says, "But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast." This is why the WMSCOG fasts on unleavened bread. That is it. That is literally all that you get. Not only that, but if you watch my Passover videos, I prove that Jesus was not crucified on unleavened bread, but actually Passover. That is a very well-known biblical fact. So Mark chapter 2 verse 20 doesn't even apply to unleavened bread, but rather the Passover. In fact, if you read early pre-Nicene church literature, it was customary for the early church to fast on Passover to remember Jesus' sacrifice. That is also a fact. Also, the passage says that when he was taken from them, they will fast. How do we know this isn't talking about the Ascension? Anyways, back to the main point. Sorry for the tangent. My main point here is simply that unleavened bread is 7 days long, and the first month 15th day and first month 21st day are a sacred assembly, and first fruits happens within unleavened bread and is considered part of unleavened bread, not considered part of Feast of Weeks. The reason why I believe the WMSCOG has to put the words following unleavened bread is to create a separation of unleavened bread and first fruits. But that is not what the Bible teaches, nor is it the understanding of the Jews. They are adding to the Bible by adding the words following unleavened bread, and they are removing from the Bible by ignoring the 7th day of unleavened bread or the first month 21st day that is a sacred assembly commanded by God, ultimately changing unleavened bread to 1 day instead of 7 to fit their doctrine. Now you might be asking yourself the following: what is the point of you proving that Resurrection Day happens during unleavened bread? Or, why are you pointing out that the WMSCOG is saying Resurrection Day comes after unleavened bread? It doesn't matter. Or, who cares if unleavened bread is 7 days or just 1 day? First reason is because they claim to keep the feast, and that they restored the feast. They clearly don't because they don't practice what the Bible says in regards to the feast, nor do they understand when the feasts actually happen, or even when the Jewish day begins. But honestly, even though this is true, this is not the reason why I bring this up. What we just went over is going to blow the whole lid open on everything. The WMSCOG will not be able to come back from what I am about to reveal to you, and you will be shocked at how devious and clever they are. So if you want to know why I want you to understand that Resurrection Day is during unleavened bread, and that unleavened bread is a 7-day feast, and how these facts will bring everything crumbling down, then please watch my next video coming out about the Sabbath. I will explain everything. Now, if you are still watching this video and you are just a normal Christian who is likely thinking, why is this important? What is this guy talking about? As a Christian, the beginning of the day, the feast, and all of this is not a salvation issue. But to the members of the WMSCOG, it is a matter of life and death. But we have proved that the overall pattern of the Bible indicates that the Jewish day is from sunset to sunset, which means that the insistence of sunrise reckoning is biblically wrong. In fact, we follow the same kind of pattern of the Jews today, even with our timekeeping. Our days start at dark or 12 a.m. Is the Jews keeping sunset to sunset really that unreasonable? The Jews are experts in the law, are they not? If that is the case, I would assume they would know when their own day starts. Ahnsahnghong did not restore sunrise or day reckoning. It never existed. WMSCOG insisting that they are the only true church because they keep sunrise reckoning is nonsense. Even our days don't start at sunrise but at 12 a.m. when it's dark or night. They didn't restore the feast and don't keep the feast according to the scriptures as we studied when it comes to unleavened bread and first fruits. They themselves do not understand the feast but condemn others for not keeping them. As Christians, yes, it is important to learn about the feast as it points to Christ. But make no mistake, it is through faith in Christ alone that we are saved. If you disagree with my findings, then that's okay. I would recommend you researching and understanding it for yourself instead of taking someone's word for it anyways. There are probably a lot of better videos with people who can more accurately explain this. If you don't understand this, it's probably my fault, so don't feel bad. Please stay tuned on my next video about the Sabbath. I will refer back to this video, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. The video about the Sabbath will make everything come crashing down on the WMSCOG. I'm going to prove in the Bible without a shadow of a doubt that the early church kept Sunday worship and there is no counter to it. Anyways, that's all I have for you on this video. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. God bless.